Was it good that people engaged in this behavior? Now, some people would say, well, yes. It increased awareness to some extent of ALS. Maybe people didn't really know too much about what it was about, but they at least kind of had an idea. Now, the Ice Bucket Challenge started as kind of a general give money to charity, and then it kind of switched to ALS really, really quickly when someone with ALS kind of, really, it really started off, really kind of exploded right at that. Additionally, we would also say, well, we could also say, with that increased awareness, there was also an increase in funding, right? Because people were giving money to the national societies that are trying to find cure for ALS. The last numbers that I saw, and this were a couple of years ago, so it may have increased some, but probably, kind of contained experience. We don't see it as much anymore. But, at the last total I saw was $22 million were raised for ALS, which was more than all of 2012 and 2013's charitable contributions. It's 9 times more than the usual amount given charitably for the study of ALS. Now, certainly more local groups, smaller groups that are more local chapters of ALS foundations received less, but some of those received even up to 50 times more than what they normally received in a year. Which, of course, that funding can lead to breakthroughs, can lead to discovery of additional drugs or development of other kinds of medications. And so on the one hand, we would say, yes, the Ice Bucket Challenge was good because it brought awareness, it raised funds for the study of this condition. Can you think of any reason or any ways in which we might say that it was not good? Well, I think in one respect we say, okay, yes, there was increased awareness on the one hand, but on the other hand, there were probably a lot of people who were participating in it, who didn't really know why they were doing it, weren't really about ALS, or might not have even been about any sort of charitable giving as well. So if that was the case, what were they doing it for? Well, we'd have to say, okay, if somebody is not doing it for a charitable reason, is not really aware of these other, I don't want to say issues, other components to this, then it becomes more about drawing attention to oneself. It becomes more narcissistic. And look at me, look at what I'm doing. Pay attention to me. So in that case, we say, well, the dumping of water over someone's head, right, which we might want to make a distinction between the Ice Bucket Challenge, which was more for ALS, and the practice of people pouring very, very cold water with ice over their heads. That's something different, we might say. And that we would say, if you're doing it for a narcissistic reason, just to bring attention to yourself, and you're not doing it for these greater good, then that's not good. That's just kind of you drawing attention to yourself. It's selfishness, narcissism, whatever words we want to use. But isn't there something essentially, inherently narcissistic in the Ice Bucket Challenge, where we couldn't distinguish the two? So do we have here a situation where we have an end that most everybody would agree is positive, right? Raising of money for scientific study of a disease that has severe consequences for those that suffer with it. We would probably say, increase in charity in that way is good. But does the means to the end have any sort of impact in that? Right? So if we say that the pouring of water over your head has a component of it that is narcissistic, which is probably something most of us would say, narcissism isn't good, even though we sometimes are very narcissistic and we can, or at least very selfish or very self-centered, egotistic, right? Maybe not to the point of narcissism, but we can be egotistic, and being egotistical is not good. Does that have any sort of impact on how we judge the morality of, or the value of, the Ice Bucket Challenge? Or do we solely look at what is the outcome of that action? And that, of course, is, I'll encourage you now to kind of take a look at, it doesn't have to be right now, but this is where Michael Sandel leads us a little bit in some very interesting ways. He has some really interesting scenarios that he develops that I think are important for us to think about when we think about ethics. So how do we think about these questions? What perceptions, what stimuli, what filters do we engage when we make ethical decisions? How about what happens after death? A different type of question, right? A question that certainly I think has some greater significance than was the Ice Bucket Challenge good or not. And I'm not so much thinking about the answer to this question as I'm thinking about how we answer this question. What are the components? What are the categories? What are the pieces of information? What are the processes we engage in to answer this question? Because I think probably if we take the time to think about it, we would say, well, different people are going to answer this question differently. So that what I say happens after death might be different than somebody who lives on the other side of the world. But is there not an objectivity? Now, we might want to believe that the afterlife, if there is one, is tailored to specific cultures and religions, so that what I as a Christian experience after death is the Christian version of that, but a Muslim might experience something different. A Buddhist might experience something different. And that might be a nice postmodern approach that we would feel comfortable with. However, such an idea begins to break down as we begin to explore this in a little bit more detail. Especially when we begin to think about, it's one thing for different groups to believe in different afterlives, right? The Hades and the Elysian fields of Greece, heaven and hell of Christianity, the heaven and hell of Islam, but slightly different in what they look like. And comparing those kind of things with atheism, which says death is it. There's nothing after death. We're going to say, well, there either is or there isn't, but maybe if we have this tailored experience, the atheist, of course, ceases to exist. Well, that just doesn't seem to make sense. Either there is that universal experience of everybody dies and that's it, or there's something else. But if we start comparing religious views on this, you have Western traditions like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, that say it's one stop and then the afterlife. Right? You have one life, and in that life, there are the expectation is you're going to live a life for God, and then after that, either reward or punishment. But it's one stop and then the next. But when you contrast that with Eastern traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, which suggest that there is a series of lives and that one life isn't it, how do we kind of make them compatible between, so what we begin to see is that there are some incongruities, there are some distinctions, there are some differences that while we would like to say the afterlife is tailored to, that there are all sorts of different paths and there are all sorts of different destinations and it's all good, and so whatever you believe is good for you, such an idea begins to break down when we start to consider the variety of traditions and how distinctly different they are, and how importantly different they are. And so when we answer questions like this, we begin to see how a lot of what we believe about these things are shaped by our culture, but there is something objective. Either there is something after or there is not. But even what is after seems like there would be something that would be a standard, a universal. And so we have to think about those kind of conceptions in this course as we're kind of breaking down and thinking about worldviews and some of these greater questions of life. So let's now get into this larger question of what is Christian cultural heritage. When we're talking about this phrase, which serves as the title for this course, we have these three components: Christian, culture, and heritage. So how do these three components relate to each other in helping us see what the purpose of this course is over the process of these several weeks? But let's take each of these components and break them down a little bit and look at them. Let's start first with thinking about this term Christian. What is Christian? What is Christianity? Now, certainly, there needs to be a recognition here that there are some important distinctions among people that identify as Christian. There's going to be some important distinctions as to what that means. there are enough different groups out there that call themselves Christian that we would say, well, wow, if we want to try and have something all-encompassing, we have the one trouble, but there would be a lot of concern a lot of people would have to try and say that their distinctive group is the right group and everybody else is wrong. Now that's a different question we're not really going to talk about, but we have these kind of two competing forces. One is this universality, right? To try to find something that would tie all of these Christian groups together. On the other hand, there's the particularity of my group, right? And is my group the right group? Or is that even a question that should be asked, right? So we have a lot of issues with this. This is not an easy question to address. Furthermore, we're really trying to encapsulate something that has been around for 2,000 years, and we're trying to encapsulate it in such a way that we are able to talk about something, right? Kind of objectify Christianity, like we can put it on our desk and we can look at it, talk about it, investigate it, right? Something. There's an object. So some people might even say there's no such object, but I think probably most of us would say yes, there is a Christianity. All right, so what is that Christianity? What is Christian?